horror off the coast of Italy as a boat of illegal migrants disintegrates, leaving potentially 100 people dead. The boat left a port in Turkey carrying 200 migrants from Syria, Iraq and Afghanistan, among others, with one of the survivors being arrested on human trafficking charges. Illegal immigration into Europe has been a hot-button issue for years, as thousands are forced to seek refuge, usually through cramped and difficult boat journeys over the Mediterranean due to deteriorating conditions in their home countries. The number of illegal immigrants reaching Europe peaked at 1.8 million in 2015 during the European migrant crisis. But after border controls stopped the heavy flow, numbers fell dramatically. But 2022 saw a resurgence in the numbers, as 330,000 made it to Europe when border controls were eased following COVID-19. But after devastating earthquakes in Turkey and Syria, as well as the Taliban's resurgence in Afghanistan, there are fears that these numbers could continue their upwards trajectory, potentially leading to many more scenes similar to the one seen in Italy. So, how can this be prevented? Does Europe have any moral obligation to accept these migrants onto their shores? How can we ensure that these people do not risk their lives to reach Europe? What will be the short and long-term effects of a new influx of migrants? Is Europe facing another migrant crisis?
So let's get to it. Is Europe facing another migrant crisis? As always, we begin with a quick fire round, 30 seconds each to lay out your initial stance on the matter, and we'll pick up the conversation from there. So Dr. Shani Bar Tuvia, please take the lead. Your 30 seconds are on.
Thank you. So my answer is very simple. Europe never faced a refugee crisis, also not in 2015, where everybody were talking about the European refugee crisis. So not in absolute terms and not in relative terms, definitely not in relative terms. In absolute terms, Europe never received, in the past few decades, a number of refugees that was too much to handle in terms of wealth and capacity. In relative terms, well, the real refugee crises are taking place in other places around the world, and of course not in Europe.
Well, the Europe cried wolf, so to speak, you're suggesting. Mr. Nikola Mirkovic, your take.
I would tend to have less an angelic view on this issue. I think that this is an ongoing situation. Unfortunately, I think that the migrant crisis is not being tackled by the European Union. It is not well done. It is not being done in a humane way. We do not have the infrastructure to greet these migrants, and there's a very big problem of integration, which is a fault of the Western European countries. And also there's a problem today of integration, and our societies in the West and some of the countries are starting to divide because there is no more common ground between the indigenous people and the migrants, and this is a problem.
Last but not least, Joel Schalit, your take?
I find it very interesting that the conversation about a new European migrant crisis focuses mostly on the South, when over 8 million Ukrainians have entered the EU from the Ukraine war due to the Ukraine conflict. The numbers, for example, for asylum claims in Italy in 2022 were not dramatically different from years before, at around 140,000, if I'm correct. So it's largely, in my view,
yeah. No, you finished the sentence, Joel Schalit. You're too polite.
I don't see any big change in the South compared to Eastern Europe.
Okay, and on that note, let's please feel free to interact from this point onwards, and let's begin with the point Joel Schalit is making, and I will ask it very simply and perhaps bluntly. Considering the influx of Ukrainian migration into Europe, is the approach towards migration simply hypocritical? Some migrants are welcome, others not so much. Dr. Bar Tuvia?
Yes, I think it demonstrates exactly the point I was trying to make, and that is that it's not a refugee crisis, it's a policy crisis. So when Europe wanted to welcome a very large number of refugees in a very short time, they did. And it showed, because this is exactly what I was saying about capacity and about wealth. It showed that when Europe wants to handle the situation and wants to give refugees the shelter that they deserve, not only morally but also legally, then Europe is capable of doing that. This is exactly why why the solution is to change policy. This is a policy crisis, to stop trying to prevent people from searching for safety, because people will continue to do that.
So, Mr. Mirkovic, is it a matter of, not a matter of resource rather, but a matter of ideology, of policy?
Well, there's a little bit of all of that. There's definitely a problem of will. There has not been a will in Western Europe to greet these migrants. That is something which is obvious. There has been no will to integrate them, to teach them the local languages, to teach them the local standards and culture. And if you just go through Paris, go to eastern Paris, and you will see, hundreds and hundreds of tents of migrants which have no place to live. If I'm going to invite somebody in my home, I will definitely have this person sleep in a bed. So we do not have the proper conditions. So there is a policy issue which is getting out of hand because it has not been tackled for the past 30 years, I'd say. And this is creating a major problem because what are you going to do with these migrants once they're here? If you don't have a job, if you don't have education for them, this is creating social problems and ghettos. So I do think that there is a policy problem which is transforming into a cultural identity and sometimes religious problem, which is really getting out of hand.
So not immigration, but rather integration. And on that note, Joel Schalit, I would like to suggest a radical shift in outlook here. Maybe the migrant, quote-unquote, problem is not a problem, but rather a solution to Europe's workforce problem.
Italian economists have been saying that repeatedly for the last decade in light of the far right's problematization of illegal migration to Italy, particularly since the Berlusconi period, actually. The economists have continually pointed out in this country the fact that Italy has a declining workforce due to Italians immigrating to other countries for higher wages, and that African and Middle Eastern migrants are perfectly poised to fill those positions.
Dr. Bar Tuvia, why is it so difficult to make this shift, to view it not as only a problem, but perhaps a solution?
Well, I really wonder, my expertise is also Israel's asylum policies compared with other countries. And when we get to the why question, it's a very complicated question to answer. But I think Europe in the past 3 decades is so, most of European countries are so used to treating irregular migration, including refugees, as something that you need to stop. So original solutions, they simply don't have a space in the discourse. It almost became a habit, even though facts are often pointing to the other direction. Facts like you mentioned about the workforce, but also the simple fact that trying to close their borders by paying other countries simply doesn't work. It doesn't work. And yet the fact that the factual ground is very, very loose for these policies doesn't stop them. Quite the opposite. They're trying harder and harder.
Mr. Mirkovic, speaking to that point, are agreements with third-party countries to accept migrants, is it moral or is it trade in humans, aka, of course, the UK Rwanda plan?
Yeah, there's a lot of hypocrisy, I think, in there. Again, I think if we want to greet somebody, we have to do this properly or we don't do it. If we have to negotiate today, I think definitely we have to negotiate with the countries where these immigrants are coming from. Part of the problem is that we have a responsibility as Western countries of the instability. You spoke about Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. Western countries have a part in the responsibility in the uneasy situation these countries have been going through. And I think the idea to solve the immigration solution, because, being a migrant isn't something just very, very pleasant, leaving your country, your friends, your family. So we should be working with these countries, cooperating with them to make sure that these people don't want to leave these countries. And I think a lot of the money which is used today, uselessly because it's not working, should be invested, should be given to these countries in cooperation to help them stay at home, have a better education, have access to jobs, have access to modern day technology so that they could work. And I think that's part of the solution, because or else we arrive at hypocritical situations where we say, we've got too many immigrants, you take them over. No, I don't want them, you take them over. These we're talking about human beings. And I think this shows the limits of the way the European Union has been managing immigration for the past, I'd say, decades.
Joel.
I would beg to differ. I think the European Union has largely failed at that strategy of trying to keep immigrants at home, particularly if you look at the refugee deal that the Germans and the EU conducted with Erdogan as a consequence of the refugee crisis that have kept millions of people stuck in refugee camps in southern Turkey for the last decade from Syria, going absolutely nowhere. So people continue to flee that region for Europe without any kind of break. So Meloni has been urging the European Union to essentially resume that policy of rewarding Middle Eastern and African states in order to keep their refugees and migrants at home. And so we're just going to be facing more of the same with more attempts to leave for Europe continuing.
And I think, may I jump in
of course,
and just say that I think that you're both talking about the same thing, but not really. So I think Europe was framing its cooperation with third countries, with home countries, as cooperation to address root sources. Right? It's a phrase they like using, to address root sources, why refugees escape to begin with, and this you need to improve the situation in their countries, and then they will not escape. So Europe was trying to frame its policies as this type of policies, but in reality they were actually doing, as you mentioned, deals with countries simply to stop the people from leaving, like physically, like really stop them with boats and walls and stuff like this, instead of really addressing. If you want to address global inequality, of course this is the solution, but to address global inequality you need to do some more serious things than to sign such a dodgy deal with Erdogan.
And what can I say? Point well made. And perhaps another element here is, instead of fighting it, should because us here too, we're speaking about this topic because of yet another tragedy off the shores of Italy. Perhaps instead of fighting it, Europe should be investing more in improving migration routes.
Of course. Well, the global smuggling industry grew disproportionately and very fast since the beginning of the 90s, and this happened when developed countries started blocking their borders with visa regimes, with all sorts of very original measures that they keep trying to invent. And then the smuggling industries got really, really developed and sophisticated to the point that we are today. So of course legal pathways was always the solution, legal pathways for refugees who need protection, but instead of increasing they are only decreasing.
Yeah, Joel, please, in the short time we have left. Yeah.
Yes, I think that EU member states need to come up with plans to bring in unskilled labor to fill unskilled labor gaps that currently exist, not just skilled labor, people with advanced degrees to become doctors or lawyers, or even mid-level white-collar jobs like nursing. Germany is always looking for example, where I've lived for 13 years, highly skilled migrants rather than middle-skilled migrants or lower-skilled migrants.
Okay, we're putting a stop right here, but we're back with part 2 of the summit in a few minutes, so do not go anywhere. We're back in a few. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Dr. Shani Bar Tuvia, Nikola Mirkovic, and Joel Schalit. Thank you all so very much for staying with us. We're also staying on topic, but before we get back to our conversation, let's take a listen to the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, speaking earlier this month before the tragedy in Italy. Can the Union ever get united on this? Let's take a listen.
Borders must be managed. We will act to strengthen our external borders and prevent irregular migration. And for that, we will focus on 2 pilot projects on borders. In other words, we will provide an integrated package of mobile and stationary infrastructure, from cars to cameras, from watchtowers to electronic surveillance.
So let's get to it. Is there a political solution to the migrant crisis? Once again, we begin with our quick fire round and pick it up from there. Mr. Nikola Mirkovic, please take the lead. Your 30 seconds are on.
Well, I think that definitely the problem we're facing today is that there is no political solution. Nobody is really tackling this for the past years. The past governments, whether right wing or left wing, are not tackling this. Everybody's afraid of being called a racist. And at the end, the younger generations are being faced with the problem with insecurity, no integration on the parts of the immigrants, refusal of the integration on parts of the immigrants. So we have to have a political issue quickly, or else this can get pretty ugly. I do think that it would be good to go to referendums. There seems to be a big difference between what the people think and what their elites think.
Okay, we will definitely get back to that in a split second. Joel Schalit, your take?
We need an end to wars on Europe's periphery, and we need practical solutions to climate change that drive people to Europe.
Okay, short and concise. Last but not least, Dr. Shani Bar Tuvia, your thoughts?
Yes, so as I said, I think this is a policy crisis, which is quite long also. And when you have a policy crisis, what you need to do is to try and change your policies that don't work. So, and it's amazing to hear the EU Commissioner and also Prime Minister Meloni, because what they are suggesting is more of the same. We'll take more airplanes and more surveillance, and we'll try harder to stop people from coming, even though this is exactly what is not working for the past 3 decades. You need to seriously address global inequality, which is only growing, and in the more immediate term, you need to let people find safety in a legal way, so then they don't need to use smugglers and make these dangerous journeys.
Okay, let's please feel free to interact once again. Nikola Mirkovic, let's circle back to the point you were making about integration or lack thereof, and the suspicion or concerns or fears of local European populations. Should Europe fortify itself?
I am very much against any surveillance type society, so I don't think that the issue is there. Probably part of it, but definitely not the solution. Western Europe is going through an identity crisis, and we have to bear this in mind. And this is also one of the problems of integration, is that I think a lot of these immigrants which have arrived have not been greeted correctly, that's for sure. And after a moment, they've been maybe pushed away, pushed aside in the society, and they're starting to build their own societies within the society. So this is dividing the society. So I think definitely that what we have to do, we have to bear in mind is that as long as Western Europe is going through this identity crisis, it's going to be difficult to be greeting even more immigrants, because they're arriving in Western Europe, and what are they ending up doing? There are not a lot of Cinderella stories, in these immigration histories. They end up rebuilding their own societies within Western Europe. So this, as the numbers go and demographics go, it can end into, big crises between the communities. Let us not forget that the previous Minister of Interior of France, Gérard Collomb, said that today we live side by side, but he fears the day we will be face to face. And he was talking about the problem between immigration and the indigenous people, or the French people. So this is not tackled. So we cannot just say that France or Western Europe is an industry and all the people have to come in because we need cheap labor or we need labor. We have to tackle this issue of how do we live together. And this is paramount, because if we can't solve the problem about how we live together, then this will end in a catastrophe.
Joel Schalit, maybe Europeans, or at least a major chunk of them, are simply not interested in living together, as Mr. Mirkovic is putting it.
I think it depends on what country you live in, and I think it depends on what your political interests are in Europeans who try to process immigration. I worked in the eye of the storm in Brussels during the 2015 refugee crisis, and as well. And I had the chance to watch my neighbors who arrived, most of whom were Palestinians and Syrians and Afghans, get settled in Berlin and in Brussels. And it was astonishing the extent to which they worked hard to integrate and start their own businesses and get on their own 2 feet. And the Germans, I can tell you, really went out of their way to try to enable them to integrate, at least economically. And so everything I saw in those quarters in Neukölln and in Brussels neighborhoods like Schaerbeek and even the dreaded Molenbeek, refugee integration was primarily achieved by means of economic integration, and the entrepreneurial energy that a lot of these migrants brought with them was really inspiring to see.
And Dr. Bar Tuvia, we're talking about the moral aspect of it, etc. But can immigration be forced on Europe?
Well, so I think, okay, I think we did touch upon several moral arguments, but we also left some very important arguments aside. I want us to remember that only 15% of refugees around the world managed to get to developed countries. And we also mentioned the fact that Europe has some responsibility to what is happening in the source countries and other moral arguments. But apart from this, there's also the practical argument. When countries want globalization, when countries want legal migrants, when countries want commercial relations with other countries, when you want open borders for some, you will get also the others. People will try to find safety. This is an historical fact. So if this is the historical fact, and if people will continue and try to find safety for themselves and for their children, then what do? How do you solve this? And I agree with my colleague who mentioned the integration in Germany in the past few years. I agree. It seems to be going in a good direction. Germany seems to have drawn the conclusions from the Turkish immigration of the previous decades. And I'm also often in Berlin, and I'm also quite impressed with how it seems that the conclusions were made. Of course, the situation is not perfect, but if you want to prevent ghettoization and if you want to prevent cultural clashes, it's not the solution is not to prevent the refugees from coming. The solution is to take care of integration, as we already mentioned.
And we are nearing the end of our discussion, and as we've pointed out several times during our conversation, it's a matter of policy, but very much so a matter of politics. Can Europe ever agree on migration? Will there ever be a one-size-fits-all policy within the borders of the EU on that, Mr. Mirkovic?
No, there won't, as there isn't on the size of potatoes or what kind of meat we must have, or on vaccines or whatever. So no, there will never be a common position. We definitely see within Europe different positions depending on the political situations, depending on the geographical situations. Middle Eastern European countries do not want to have immigrants coming from Africa, for example, because they don't have any history bonding them to those countries, and they've stated it many times. Poland, Hungary, they don't want the Balkan countries in the Balkan either. And in the West, they've got different ways of tackling, different ways of addressing this issue. It's becoming a very political. I think we must bear in mind what the people are saying when they go to vote. A lot of anti-immigrant parties are getting a lot of votes. We cannot do as if they don't exist.
Joel Schalit, is it more about the EU than it is about migration?
No, I think that the EU has been unable to secure any kind of general agreement on how to uniformly process and settle refugees, and I think that the window has passed to secure such an agreement, at least in the West, amongst the Western states, with the election of Meloni. I think up until now it had only been the Eastern states that were prohibiting the conclusion of some kind of binding agreement that everyone would work with. And now I think it's going to be more a matter of national competence, as they say in EU speak, for any kind of thing, any kind of positive resolution to happen.
Dr. Bar Tuvia, in the 10 seconds we have left, your concluding remarks.
Well, I don't think I have something to add. Legal pathways.